Started. Oh, shoot. What slide am I on? 30.
I also read ahead in the textbook, not ahead, but I read this chapter, and I think we covered like some stuff last week from the chapter. Like, not like in depth, but maybe just in like tangent conversation.
Yeah, probably. I mean, we're still on the neural correlates of consciousness chapter. And as I was saying to Ben earlier, and for everyone online, hi, by the way. After this, I'm going to kind of just get a feel for what people want to learn about next. And we'll just kind of selectively cover other stuff. And I was thinking we could start with dreams, because we kind of had a cool tangent about dreams last time. And I already have a lecture topic or a lecture, I already have like a dreams and consciousness lecture put together that we could probably spend one or even two classes on, depending upon how much discussion happens. The more discussion, the more interesting it'll be. But it looks like everybody online is like, yeah. So Sarah says dreams are very interesting. I did a whole essay on dreams for one of my cog sci classes. So did Katie. Yeah, so perfect. Okay, so after neural correlates of consciousness, please read the chapter on dreams. I don't remember what section it's in, but just go ahead and look up the table of contents, and we'll talk about dreams, because dreams are really cool. Hey, dreams are interesting because I kind of like what we were talking about last time. They have, at least for me, they're really interesting to think about because they help clarify things like mental representations. They can give us a sense of how we might actually perceive the world. The difference between waking and dreaming consciousness. I think last time you made a point about being conscious while unconscious. Yeah, that was one of the first kinds of things that philosophers and psychologists and cognitive scientists had to kind of figure out when lucid dreaming entered the conversation, right? Because it seemed to a lot of people at the time that was a contradiction. A lot of philosophers were like, that's nonsense. You're unconscious when you're asleep. Even regular dreams, they would say, are unconscious, right? But there's reasons maybe to doubt this that have emerged since then. We'll talk about all of that. It'll be really fun. But for now, just for some quick recap, we're on slide 30 for people at home. We were talking about Logothetis and his colleagues working with macaque monkeys and investigating cases of binocular rivalry. Binocular rivalry, remember, is when we present one stimulus to one eye, a different stimulus to the other, and they sort of flip back and forth. You don't see both at the same time. One is more conscious than the other at any given time, and they sort of flip, a bit like the Necker cube and other ambiguous figures. So here, Logothetis had trained the macaques to pull different levers to report the flips that they were experiencing. So we had a vertical grating in one eye and a horizontal grating in the other, and the monkeys are pulling levers. And they searched for areas of the brain that were corresponding to these changing perceptions, but not the unchanging visual inputs, because it's not like we're showing one image at a time. We're showing them at the same time. So the stimuli, the visual stimuli, don't change. Rather, the perception, or the monkey's perception of them, changes. And just to recap, in the early visual cortex, so we're talking area V1, we've got cells responding to the unchanging input. And there are certain specialized cells here. Some of these neurons respond to vertical stripes, some to motion, some to horizontal stripes. But the important thing is that activity in V1 didn't change when the macaques reported with their lever pulls a change in their perception. But further up the pathway, so for example, in area V4, some cells' activity actually was different, depending on what the monkeys reported see. And here in the inferior temporal cortex, almost all the cells changed their response according to what was reported. So it appears that the neural activity further up the processing hierarchy, or further up the pathway, corresponds to consciously perceived stuff, whereas stuff lower down in the pathway, processing sort of like V1, V2 in those low areas, doesn't change with the reported experiences. So does that mean that the neural correlates of visual experience lie in that area of the brain? Well, I think this is where we left off. If we answer yes, well, that answer depends on an assumption, and that assumption is that macaque brains are, close enough to our brains or similar enough to our brains that their conscious experiences are similar to ours as well. And I think that's reasonable. I would be perfectly fine making that assumption, but we still don't know for sure. This is the same problem we're dealing with all along, even, just with our own conscious experiences. How do I know that you guys are all conscious, right? Yeah, it's the worry about solipsism. It's the problem of other minds, except with monkeys. Usually we do this with people. How do I know you aren't robots? Well, I judge that you're not robots, or, if you're Descartes, you make a judgment. If you're Wittgenstein, maybe you think, that's just weird. What? It doesn't make sense. But anyway, so note that this was done with single unit recording. And we don't really do this in humans because it's too invasive. But functional neuroimaging means that we can actually start to do something similar. We don't need to do something invasive like open up somebody's skull and attach patch clamps to groups of neurons. Yeah, that's what these single unit recordings devices are. We use something called a patch clamp.
How do they get the monkeys to participate?
Well, it's not like they're getting the monkey's consent, right?
Well, no, but when I mean, if you have something attached to, I don't know.
What they do is they perform brain surgery on the monkeys. Yeah, and they'll attach everything where it needs to be and then close everything up. And then usually after the experimental, like the series of experiments, whatever they can do with the animal is over, the animals are usually euthanized. So, that's why I said last time, I couldn't be a neuroscientist, I don't know. Monkeys are too smart.
Elon Musk doing neuroscience on monkeys.
Yeah, at Neuralink, right?
Yeah.
Silken, that is not nice at all. No. And I'm not like a super duper hardcore animal person. I like animals. I have pets. I'm not a vegetarian, but I try not to eat anything that can recognize itself in a mirror. That's just my personal thing. Although pork is hard, bacon is so delicious, but but they are so smart. Yeah, they're smarter than dogs. So, but yeah, I just couldn't do that. And, if you're a cognitive scientist, you just work with people and you don't have to kill anything, which is nice. So if you're a human scientist working with humans, you can use functional magnetic resonance imaging. And we look and see, remember, I think I talked a little bit about how this works. fMRI uses the bold signal. So basically oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, because we have hemoglobin in our blood, which uses iron, and iron is magnetic. So oxygenated and deoxygenated hemoglobin affect magnetic fields differently. And based on where the blood is flowing, the assumption being that those are the active areas, we can see where the activity is. So we'll throw some people in an MRI machine. We'll give them stereoscopic glasses that will show them a red drifting grading pattern in one eye and a green face in the other eye. And then the experimenter or the participants just have to press buttons, that are kind of fixed in the machine, just to indicate what they're seeing. The stimuli were different enough in these experiments that the experimenters were able to investigate specialized brain areas. So areas for color, areas for forms, areas for faces, right? We have the fusiform gyrus, which has an area within it called the fusiform face area. It's mostly for faces. They erased my happy face, actually. So, so they searched for areas in the brain where there was more activity when the face was seen versus when the grading was seen. Consciously seen, I mean.
Is there that like they noticed more activity or just that part of the brain has more activity? Because like another part of the human brain is we just see random faces and stuff, right? What if that part of our brain is just like overactive?
Well, that's why we use the bold signal. And we take also a baseline reading.
Okay.
So you will have, we'll just give some, look at this static, something like that. Well, it's called a screen. Like we'll show that in both eyes and get a nice reading of the baseline activity. Also, the important thing to mention, and this is probably something that's not emphasized enough, certainly not in popular science or in documentaries and that sort of thing. But with functional magnetic resonance imaging, if you're watching a documentary on the mind or something and you see an image of a brain with all those lights, that's not one brain. That's like an average of 12 or 13 people's brains, right? Because we have to use as big a sample size as we can. But in neuroscience studies, the sample sizes still tend to be small because these machines are very expensive, right? Like you can go, there's actually in Hull, there's a private MRI clinic. We can't have private MRI clinics in Ontario, but in Quebec you can. So there's an MRI machine and you could book some time and go there, but it's like $500 an hour. It's expensive. So imagine you're running an experiment. You need to get a participant in there for 2-3 hours, maybe, depending. That's a lot. And you got to do that for a dozen people. It's a really expensive study.
Baseline, average, you got your case study, you got your test study, you got
too many studies. Yeah.
Yeah.
So always keep that in mind when you're looking at a representation of a brain with all those blinky lights. The lights represent blood flow to areas that are assumed to be more active, but these are, this is not any one person's brain. Unless maybe we are doing a case study of an interesting brain, like Kim Peek. Kim Peek. Anyone heard of Kim Peek? They called him Kimputer. Maybe I'll show you after the lecture. Anyway, Kim Peek was a savant. We talked about savants before, but Kim Peek had a curious condition where he had something called agenesis of the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum, you'll recall, is the network that connects the two hemispheres of the brain. Kim Peek doesn't have a corpus callosum. So it's essentially like his brain was just like one big hemisphere. And he had really exceptional powers of memory, even though doing day-to-day things were difficult for him and he couldn't live alone. So yeah, so if you wanted to study, Kim Peek's brain, then you'd still have to compare it to like 12 other normal brains, for lack of a better term, right? So anyway, when these experimenters showed the participants the face, they detected bilateral activity, so both sides, activity on both sides, in occipitotemporal areas of the ventral visual pathway. So occipital temporal, that's where the temporal lobes and occipital lobes kind of connect, where they sort of, the border between them, if you like. And including parts of the fusiform gyrus, which we should expect, because that's what we use for recognizing faces. So that's the lower level stuff. They also wanted to investigate the flipping, the perceived flipping. So they recorded the participant series of key presses, and they played back the same sequence of images that the participant, it was binocular rivalry. It's like, oh, I see the face, I see the grading, They just played that back play the images back in that order. And that way they could compare the brain activity from the same sequence of images, where one was just sort of flipping spontaneously, and in the other it was determined, like now you're going to see this, now you're going to see this, showing sort of one eye at a time, right? And if we look at the difference in the activity, sometimes we call these subtraction studies, because we're taking, you know, a thing, subtracting the baseline, or taking two conditions and looking at the difference. So we're looking at the difference here between the spontaneous binocular rivalry flips and the determined flips. And they found differences in lots of areas. One area was in the parietal cortex, another in the frontal. And their findings, just as with the previous study, suggest that conscious visual experience isn't correlated to lower levels of visual processing, like in area V1. It's rather correlated, or seems to be, with central areas that are higher up in that information processing pathway, right? So consciousness is not a lower level sort of thing. It doesn't seem anyway. And what does this mean for like simpler life forms? Maybe simpler life forms are not very conscious. It depends. I don't know. Some researchers have concluded things like, things like the following. David Chalmers says, well, this seems to show that these are the areas where consciousness is generated. So these really are the neural correlates of consciousness, but they're not just correlates. They're in some sense causal, perhaps. Consciousness is generated in the brain by activity in these areas. And I assume Chalmers would maybe also think that consciousness can cause changes in brain states too, because he's kind of a dualist. He's like a property dualist, right? So yeah, there's like, yeah, like the mental and the physical are both natural, but they're different kinds of properties that just stuff can have, right? So Ramachandran thinks that these studies will help us to narrow down, quote, those brain processes that are qualia laden as opposed to those that are not. So those brain processes that generate experiences that are like something, that have that ineffable sort of whatness to them, right? And Crick and Koch say, quote, it is the transient results of the computations which correlate with qualia. Most of the computations leading up to those results are likely to be unconscious. Which, I mean, yeah, okay. I can follow you there. V1, not conscious, but further up the chain, we get to a point where something becomes conscious, but all the information processing leading up to that is unconscious. So that makes sense. And Jackendoff thinks that intermediate levels of computation, which are associated with qualia, that's a weird sentence. What I'm saying there is that Jackendoff thinks it's intermediate levels of processing rather than the lowest or the highest. So something like Crick's and Koch's thing that they're saying here is maybe compatible with like a higher order thought or higher order perception understanding. Like, remember hot or hop, where if you have a perception or a thought about other perceptions and thoughts, that's when you have consciousness. Yes.
Is it still higher order if it's just like the doorway into consciousness? So like, because what they're talking about is like, this is the point where it becomes consciousness, but and then like to infer like higher order thinking and higher order perception, those orders of thinking and perception have to like happen in the conscious field, you know?
Yeah, like
they don't happen unconsciously. So you have to break through into the conscious in order to have those higher order thoughts and perception.
yeah, it really depends what you mean, right? Like, according to a higher order perception theory, for example, I'm not conscious of, oh, that. that red thing up there. Let's say that's a fire alarm thing. So now I'm conscious of it because I'm like, oh, I'm looking at that thing up there, right? But before that, you know, when I was looking around, there was still something there.
Yeah.
You know, it's not like I wasn't experiencing anything. So there's degrees of consciousness, and it depends on how you mean conscious versus unconscious. Like, was I unconscious of that? In a sense I was, but in a sense I also wasn't,
Yeah.
because it was there and I could bring it into my foveal view and focus on it and then think to myself, oh, I'm perceiving that thing there.
Yeah.
You know?
said you're like perceiving or experiencing something before it comes conscious. Like you can be consciously perceiving or experiencing, but not consciously experiencing or perceiving one thing at the time.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like, well, it's very much. just
It's like say,
workspace theory.
yeah.
Everything is like, it's there, but it's just that like spotlight focus on the one thing.
Yeah. Like, think of when maybe you've got the television on, but then you're on your phone and you're scrolling, and it's not like you stop hearing the television.
Yeah.
You know, it's there. It's just kind of like womp, 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 and you don't really hear it.
Yeah. And there's something like in the television that could pop up that like might just be like or if you off your phone.
Yeah, maybe something comes on, I don't know, a guitar solo,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, what's that? Like, I don't know, right?
It also seems to me like people are finding what consciousness is.
Yes.
Is it just focus and awareness, or is it like self-awareness on the focus? Like it seems like that's the difference between freaking hope and like.
Yeah, I would say so. And that's kind of what I was getting at before, right? Like, all of these are kind of right and wrong, just depending on what you meet. To be conscious, do I have to be fully conscious? Do I have to have like higher order thoughts and perceptions, or do I just have to be awake and aware? Right? You know, and that's why throughout the book, Blackmore has little blurbs everywhere, like, how conscious are you right now? You know,
that freaks me out.
yeah, she sprinkles those all over the book, and she does it with purpose, you know.
Yeah.
I was gonna say it actually helped me to like read it better because I sometimes do just automatic reading. And then it would like kind of break character and then be like, are you aware of yourself right now?
Yeah.
Like, do you know what the context of this word is? And I'm like, no, I have to reread this paragraph.
Yeah, like one thing to illustrate, you know, how conscious you are or aren't, that I learned from in a neuroscience class I was taking is, you know, you're obviously all pretty conscious right now, but are you conscious of how your shoes feel on your feet?
Oh.
Now you are, but you weren't before, right? So, but it's not like there was nothing happening. Like even me, before I thought of that example, I'm like walking back and forth and I'm wearing shoes and, you know, so yeah, this is all very complicated.
But it's like, yeah, it's like, you know, like you draw your attention to that.
Mm-hmm.
So that, but then you're not reflecting on that attention necessarily.
No, not necessarily.
It's kind of interesting.
Yeah. But I guess the quick way of summing all this up is that it's all very much up for debate, and the debate depends on your definitions. It's always very important. This is why philosophy is helpful for understanding consciousness, because you've got neuroscientists, right? Ramachandran, neuroscientist; Chalmers, philosopher, cognitive scientist. Crick was a geneticist; Koch, cognitive scientist and philosopher. Jackendorf, I'm not sure. Jesse Prince, another philosopher. You need the philosophers because the other people are all speaking a different vocabulary. Like neuroscientists talking about the self means something very different from what philosophers typically do, right? But philosophers, because philosophers are good at asking fundamental questions about things, they are really good mediators in interdisciplinary work like this. So. And they all variously agree and disagree. I mean, Prince agrees with Jackendorf, for example. He says that conscious states are attentionally modulated intermediate level representations. So they may be higher order or intermediate, but they're definitely not lower level. Definitely not. We know we can rule that out. Well, as our discussion seems to indicate, problems do remain for understanding all of this, right? We still have the problem of causality versus correlation, right? These are all just correlations. There's the question of exactly what the causal relations actually are. And Nancy Canwisher has done a lot of work. She's a neuroscientist. She's done a lot of work on identifying or searching out these causal relations. In a similar study to the one we covered from Logothetis, Afraz and colleagues trained monkeys to categorize images. Simple binary classification, face or not face. And then they stimulated clusters of neurons in the ventral visual system while the monkeys looked at ambiguous images. You remember in the ventral visual system, we saw some activity, namely in the fusiform gyrus, bilaterally, right? So basically what they're doing here is they're showing the monkeys images. The monkeys are trained like, okay, face, not face. And if they're good, they'll get a grape or something, you know. So they train the monkeys up. The monkeys are looking at some ambiguous images, so images that don't really look like anything. And they're stimulating the face area in the brain. And the monkeys were more likely to indicate that they were seeing a face in these ambiguous figures because the face area of the brain was being stimulated by the experimenter. They'd use some kind of electrical stimulation, probably like, again, with patch clamps and, you know, all kinds of barbaric monkey brain surgery, right? But yeah, they were like, yeah, yeah, they could push it, but like so imagine somebody did that to me, like had my brain hooked up and yeah, zap me, and I might see faces like where you would just see nothing, right?
Okay, so like I just wanna I have a
Yeah.
So like the one we were talking about there, the code science, right?
Yes.
Like theoretically, if you were able to use that technology, a very complex technology, you might be able to get yourself some code.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think that if we allow Mary to actually have complete physical knowledge of color,
Yeah.
then she would already know, like, oh, if I, you know, stimulate this area of the brain, like the Martian colors example from the colorblind synesthete we talked about, right? Like he's like, when I look around the world, there's certain colors I don't see. But if you tell me to think of a number, I see that color. But I can't see it, like maybe he doesn't see red. So this would look grayish, I guess, right? But he still knows red from his number synesthesia, which is like, oh, that's so far out. Like
I was actually gonna say, as somebody who's colorblind, like I can still tell the difference between colors if compared next to each other. So like if I see something that looks green, but then it's next to something that's actually green, I can tell that one's an imposter green. And
okay.
I can tell that's the real green, that's the imposter green. And if you ask me why, I go,
So I want, can I ask you something? If the, so you, when you have the real green and the imposter green, does the imposter green still look phenomenally similar? Like, is it phenomenally green?
I was gonna say it does that thing where like if I put my eyes directly on the line, there's a sharp contrast, but then if I look over to one side, it kind of fades in, and if I look over to the other, it fades in.
It's so hard. It's other minds. It's the problem of other
Yeah.
minds again. I can't.
But
I just can't. You know.
It leads to these really interesting scenarios where, like, if you have something that's consistently color lined up, take for instance a bunch of wood pallets, but they're slightly different wood grains. Like just depending on which palette I'm looking at, all of the palettes can appear to be a slightly different color.
So So it's not like the imposter green looks like gray or no.
It kind of, because part of color blindness is it actually, the brain does do effort in like filling in the missing colors.
Oh,
but
interesting.
because it doesn't have a frame of like for a lot of people who were born colorblind, because they don't have a frame of reference,
Right.
it does the same thing that pink does, which is like fake color.
Huh. I guess. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I just want to ask, like, is it like in colorblindness? Is it something to do with the eyes or with the brain?
It's I mean, you could have color blindness with the brain, but the most common is you're missing, I'm pretty sure it's rods in your eye. And because like there's the whole color spectrum and color wheel. When you're missing rods, it just means that like you miss chunks of that color, because each rod is set up to pick up a specific wavelength. And if you're missing rods at a certain wavelength, then you can't see color of that wavelength.
Huh.
Oh, like,
So
okay, yeah.
yeah, when your brain can't see that color, it knows that something's there, and so it just compares it to the nearest one on either side.
Okay.
And so that's why if you're like blue colorblind, some things can turn out purple, because purple's close enough that the brain goes, why not?
Huh. Interesting. You know, maybe it's comparable to if you know about music and stuff, like it's comparable to not having absolute pitch, right? Absolute pitch, perfect pitch.
Yeah.
Right? Somebody with perfect pitch can identify the tone being played without a reference. And by the way, some people have this idea that they can train themselves to have perfect pitch. There's probably a developmental window, like with language. And we know this because in languages that are tonal, like certain Asian languages, where whether you go up or down in pitch or make it long or short is a different word, right? And perfect pitch is actually more prevalent in communities that speak tonal languages, which suggests that there's a critical period for it. Some people have this idea that they can train themselves into it as adults, which you can't really do, because all those people are doing is just memorizing pitches and using a memorized pitch as a reference, which is not quite the same thing.
Oh, so that's different.
That is different. That would just be like pseudo perfect pitch. You can do the same thing with it.
Yeah.
It's still useful. Like I have pretty good pitch memory, but I do not have perfect pitch.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, it is very similar, because like I've learned how to distinguish color because I have a frame of reference that I can just remember.
Yeah.
But
like I can imagine the strings on my guitar and listen to a song and go like, is it in standard tuning, or would I need to use a capo or down tune, or that's on an 8-string or that's on a 7-string. Like I can do that well enough. But if you play me some piece of piano music and ask me what key it's in, like I can't tell you that, right?
So
that's the perfect pitch thing.
People with perfect pitch. I'm not the look this up.
It almost like sense feature, but for like you can just recognize a sound as like notation, like automatic.
Yeah, I mean some
You're like, oh yeah, that's an A,
yeah,
that's a B line,
some people with perfect pitch seem to be synesthetes.
yeah.
Others do not, though, and that's important. Donovan's hand is up here, though. What
Yeah, so I don't know if this is related to what we're talking about, but it's interesting. I do not have perfect pitch. But when it comes to like music, like I played in like in band like all through middle and high school, and I found that I am really good at telling when like me or someone else is playing is out of tune, but I cannot tell you what direction at all.
Yeah, so that's fair. And that's something that, I mean, we listen to so much music throughout our lives that we all know what it's supposed to sound like, right? Like if I asked you about perfect fifths and minor thirds and dominant sevenths, if you didn't know music, you'd be like, what? But you know those sounds, you know them implicitly. I could play them and you'd be like, oh, that's like that song,
Music dynamics has such an effect because our brain's so used to like hearing like a regular thing, but when it goes something else, it records it our fingers.
Yeah.
oh yeah, like horror soundtracks are literally entirely based off of unnerving the listener by like subverting their expectations in terms of the musical style.
Yeah, we have like tritones and dissonance and things
Yeah.
like that, and that's just like, it's a mental representation of not sounding good.
Yeah, but it's also learned, it's learned, like the ancient Greeks used musical scales that are similar to the diatonic scales that we use in Western music, which all really comes from church modes and stuff back in the day, from like liturgical music. But the Greeks thought that, the minor scale, which we think sounds sad, well, they thought the major scale sounded sad, but a lot of musicians don't talk about sadness and happiness. They talk about brightness and darkness. So like Lydian, the major scale, those are going to be your bright modes. And down at the bottom, you've got like Locrian is the darkest mode. You're probably not going to hear that unless you're listening to some kind of, like Zoe says, some horror or some kind of weird jazz or metal or something. You're not going to hear that very often. Although I think Bjork uses it in one of her songs. So I don't know. But anyway, yeah, music is crazy. And some people, my high school music teacher used to do this exercise, and this kind of relates to Donovan's point. He would do an exercise for ear training in high school where he would just sit at the piano where you couldn't hear or you couldn't see him. And he'd play a note and then play a note that's either one note above or below. So one semitone, the next key on the keyboard, right? And it was just to see if you could tell which was higher or lower. And some really couldn't tell. Like, it'd be like do, do, and oh, it's lower, but no, it's not. And, so differences in color perception, pitch perception, there's all kinds of variation, right? Really cool stuff.
Also, like, I was a drummer in high school, and it's kind of interesting to learn that. Because some people who start drumming, like have a really good sense of like rhythm.
Yeah.
Like keeping it steady. But then some people don't.
Yeah, some people have the knack for certain instruments.
Yeah, I was a drummer in high school, and I was tasked with teaching a new drummer how to drum, and I, like, not trying to brag, but I was somebody who, like, I have really good rhythm before. I
Yeah.
was tapping my feet along with songs and just matching it and stuff like that. And this person, like, I don't know, it kind of like felt like trying to teach somebody how to breathe. All I could do was gasp.
That's like when I have a class with, not good students. Not like, oh, everyone here, you guys are all great. But, I get it. So when I was in high school, I did a tutoring thing where it was a guitar class. So we had two drummers, I think 3 or 4 bass players, and about 20 acoustic guitars, all playing Seven Nation Army by the White Stripes and struggling with it. And I'm like, like, how do I don't know. Because I was already pretty learned in the ways of guitar at that point. But, it was fun to kind of teach. I guess it was like the first time I ever did any teaching.
Seven Nation Army who missed the like one beat. Do, 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 do.
Yeah.
They missed one beat.
It's true. Like, and yeah, I mean, because I was in the rock band, we had a rock band instead of a regular band. And so we were playing like some classic rock, some top 40. I think that year, what was the tricky song we did that year? We did some Rush, which was, yeah, we did Closer to the Heart by Rush, which was fun. And so, and then so you go and teach 20 people to play Seven Nation Army, and then you got to go and like play some Rush, or some Metallica or something, and you're like, oh man, that was easy before, but yeah. So, but anyway, yeah. What is the drums for Seven Nation Army? It's just the kick drum.
I was
right?
gonna say I used to play bass guitar for a little bit, and Seven Nation Army came up, and I realized there wasn't a bass part.
Yeah, no, it's a pitch shifter. Yeah,
so that
he
was
uses a
my
whammy
favorite
pedal.
song.
Yeah, he uses an old whammy pedal and just shifts it down an octave. So.
Cool. Have you ever seen the documentary of Mike Epps with it's him, Jimmy Page, and Edge?
I haven't. I haven't.
Always so cool. You really love that.
I might check it out. I mean, I like Jimmy Page.
You don't like the Edge?
He's okay. I don't know. I'm not into U2.
That's the second person I've heard.
Like,
say
it's
that.
just-
I've
it's-
never been like,
some of the early stuff is good. Like Joshua Tree is good, but then like,
oh, let's think of like into the 2000s and stuff. I'm like very much less.
oh yeah, they're terrible
Same with
now.
Coldplay. Same with Coldplay.
I never got into Coldplay either.
2000s was good, and then what's
Yeah. I've always been off in some weird other musical area. When this is popular, I'm listening to something else, and I just kind of follow my ears, you know. But people in the chat get it too. Like, yeah, and music's one example, but you know, any example. Like, there are things that I'm terrible at. I'm actually terrible at chess, right? I'd be a bad chess student. I love chess, but I'm not good at it. You know, I just kind of do it for fun. And because I can talk about it in classes like this. So, you know, I'd be
Yeah.
frustrating student too. But anyway, to get back to the neural correlate stuff, none of these different approaches remove the magic or remove the magic from the magic difference. We're still left with the mysteries of qualia. Qualia is interesting, you know, color identification, pitch. Someone with perfect pitch, not to digress, will tell you that A has a different character from, you know, A flat.
If somebody with perfect pitch is listening to music and they have perfect pitch, would that not be like the most accurate quality? Like, would all people with perfect pitch experience pitch in the same way?
Well, it depends, because like some people with perfect pitch might have it maybe because of synesthesia.
Right.
So I think Franz Liszt was a composer who associated, he got into an argument with somebody about what colors the notes were. They each had like different synesthetic experiences, and you know, so Franz Liszt is like, C is white, and the other guy's like, no, it's beige. Like, "Arr," and they had like an angry fight via letters about what colors they were. So yeah, it depends. So it's still very mysterious. And why does consciousness arise at one level of processing and not another? Or is consciousness really arising at that one level, or is it's a result of everything that happened before in the stream of processing, right? Like, we might be committing the mereological fallacy there, like, oh, it's this level that's conscious. Well, is it really though? Maybe also the whole enterprise is misconceived, right? If vision is some kind of grand illusion, then there really isn't any, you know, representation in the brain. There's no, quote, vivid representation in our brains of the scene directly before us. So there's no movie in the head, right? So if we're looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, well, maybe that's doomed to fail because there's no special place and time in the brain. There's no Cartesian theater where the magic happens. It's the whole thing, maybe. Or maybe it's strange loops between the cortex and the thalamus. You know, we don't know. We could all be strange loops. And the same goes for the correlates of the contents of consciousness. So not just the states that are conscious and what the difference is between those and unconscious states, but what are those states representing? What is their content? You know, earlier I was conscious of the fire alarm thingy. I could be conscious of my keys now, you know, or whatever's out the window. How do I represent windows and keys and fire alarms, right? How are the contents represented?
Like, I mean, I don't think like for everything that's part of it that I've read, it's like it doesn't seem like anything know what subjectivity is. But do you think that like understanding what it does sort of demystifies what it is?
In a sense, yeah, because the problem of subjectivity is that, you know, you are a subject and I'm a subject, and we can't get out of that.
Yeah.
And yet what we want is an objective understanding of how it all works. So, you know, and some people think that maybe we just don't have the brains for understanding how consciousness works, right?
No, what if
Some-
our brains can't understand
Yeah.
how our brains work, but other brains can understand how our brains work?
Yeah, maybe
What if
some,
whales are like, what are you these little idiots doing?
Yeah, maybe there are some aliens, some advanced aliens that could figure it out, or maybe some kind of advanced artificial intelligence could figure it out. But some people think like, no, our brains are not sophisticated enough to figure this out. You know, it's a possibility. Yeah.
So I know this is kind of like an outdated thought at this point, but there were some ideas that like, oh, you had to have sight to like have consciousness, or like a couple other things, or like higher order thinking required higher order senses.
Yeah. Well, language, like you mentioned, I
Yeah.
think is a big one. Some people think we need language.
Yeah,
For
and
consciousness.
I was really curious because like I know sharks can sense like electromagnetic waves and
Yeah.
stuff like that as part of their brain. And I was like, that's one of those instances where like I'm really interested in I don't know, because like a shark is conscious, but like we think of them as like kind of reptile brain.
Yeah, I suppose.
But then they sense an entire like concept that we can, in the same way that like birds can see thermal drafts,
Yeah.
and understand thermal waves, and like they have a completely different realm of movement to us. So like, what if there's a large part of our brain that we just can't understand because we don't have the senses to understand it?
Maybe, or maybe we're using the wrong senses. Maybe our sense of subjectivity makes us think about this in all of the wrong
The
ways.
brain is actually all pheromones. We need to sniff it really hard.
Yeah. Well, this is Dennett's whole thing, right? Is like, okay, you need to get out of the Cartesian. You need to stop. You need to forget about this idea that you're a self. And I know, you know, that's hard because that's what our experience tells us. But Dennett does think that we can figure this out with our brains, but we need to dispel our poor ways of thinking. So we can figure it out, but maybe we just haven't figured out the right way to think about all of this yet, right? So that's possible.
The cool thing I was thinking about, just like looking at the rest of this, in like section 5 of Blackboard, they were talking about the Iliad and how they talk about the self in the Iliad.
Yeah.
And it's like they don't talk about any, like all the warriors in it, the decisions that they make are like explained as a previous living
Yeah.
by like God. And then also there's no discussion of like the self-awareness of the warriors.
Yeah.
So it is true that like the way that we thought about consciousness, either the way that we thought about consciousness has changed or consciousness itself has changed.
Yeah. Because the Iliad was, well, it was written down thousands of years ago, but it was told longer than that,
Yeah.
right? But yeah, back then, you know, we understood ourselves, at least in, you know, the Greeks understood themselves in terms of mythos, you know, and that's what the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of that is. And it's true, back then, you know, everything was fate, and the world, you know, there was a god for everything. Like, have you ever read the Iliad? It's awesome. You can get a really great translation by.
I was gonna say the translation really is what affects it.
Yeah.
Because there's one that was done like Civil War time. And
Yeah.
it really sucked.
You need to get a good I'll look one up. I know the name. Let me just.
All three of them,
Yeah.
Oh, also the pacing is kind of weird. Years pass in like a couple of paragraphs.
Yeah.
And they spend a good chunk in like a 10-minute conversation. I don't know. Old writing styles.
I think it's if I'm just looking. Yeah, by Lombardo. It's a modern vernacular translation. Whoops. Yeah, it's a modern vernacular English. It's the one I read in undergraduate. It's pretty metal. Like, it's really good. But yeah, it's all fate. It starts off, you know, with the gods. You know, the poet is singing to the muses. You know, sing goddess, Achilles' rage. He's talking about the muses, right? So,
like, you know, I always thought about that as like, oh, this isn't like the way it is, but maybe there's like a point of that in that way. Maybe it's not the gods, but like maybe it's just chemicals, you know?
yeah. or well, it's all in one way or another, it's determinism,
Yeah.
right? So, yeah. But yeah, let's go. I thought we weren't going to finish these, but I think we might be able to finish these slides today. And then we can talk about dreams, or start talking about dreams next time, right? But yeah, what approaches can we take? One other approach is to forget about locating consciousness. Imagine instead that, you know, any kind of experience depends on multiple processes in multiple brain areas, right? We need a complete integrated system to give us the kinds of conscious experiences that we report. So it's not like consciousness is realized in one part of the brain or another. We need a whole brain. And people who subscribe to the extended mind hypothesis will take this even further. They'll say that you don't just need the entire brain. You also need that brain to be in a body, and you need that body to be in a physical environment, right? You need to be able to interact with the environment, do things, move around, right? And I think these findings are really interesting on an extended mind interpretation, because they tell us, you know, they tell us the brain areas that might be necessary or sufficient, or both, for reportable experiences. But they don't tell us that there's any kind of location, right? It avoids the Cartesian theater, right? I mean, yes, you need to have activity in higher visual processing areas. You need to have activity in your fusiform area, right? If you're going to perceive a face and have a conscious experience of a face. Okay, yeah, you need that stuff, but it's not like that's where the awareness is. The awareness is kind of spread out in the whole system, you know, from the brain to the body to the world.
Well, like, if you like, well, sleep practice, person who's like lost a lot of people, not like a lot of culture.
Yeah, that's true. But say like they you know, they're still able to get around, right? Or maybe before their injury they were getting around, so their brain is kind of wired up a certain way. But you know, you still need the body and the world. It's not like, because really we're not brains in bats, right? Hillary Putnam, analytic philosopher from the I can't remember where, either the UK or the US, I can never remember, but Hillary Putnam was an interesting dude who had this brain in a vat thought experiment. You know, imagine if you were a brain in a vat. It's a bit like Descartes' evil demon. How Descartes imagines, oh, there could be an evil demon that could convince me that triangles have 4 sides and that 2 + 2 = 5. You
There's a
know,
number between 3 and 4.
yeah. Well, there's numbers between 3 and 4, not natural numbers, but there's numbers, right? 3.5, 3.6. I could keep going ad infinitum, literally. But yeah, we don't have that kind of time. But yeah, no. What was I saying? I've lost my train of thought now.
Brain in the vat.
The brain in the vat is like Descartes' evil demon, in that, you know, I could be a brain in the vat, and maybe some kind of computer programmer is just stimulating my brain in the right way. Yeah, like the Matrix, exactly. The Matrix is just people in vats, right? Brains in
Kinda
vats.
dark. I like the sim approach.
The
Well,
Sims, like,
Sims for the like little tiny people inside the computer.
oh, the Sims. Yeah, I never played the Sims, but yeah.
There's something just about the whimsical way they live their life, and the fact that they could die at any moment, that I don't know, it seems very fit to life.
Yeah, that's the idea, right? It's a simulation. Okay, so Hillary Putnam was from the US. Okay. Thank you. I think it's just the name Hillary Putnam.
Oh,
It just sounds kind of British. So yeah, but Silkins looked it up. So thank you. sorry, someone was saying something?
Well, I was gonna say like, the simulation is kind of just like a variation of what.
Yeah. It's a variation on lots of things, like I remember that show that used to be on Discovery. I think it was called Through the Wormhole, and it had Morgan Freeman explaining everything to you. And
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
yeah, it was cool, but there was some junk science there that I'd catch every once in a while. One of them was the simulation episode, like, do we live in a simulation? And you know, you got your scientists like, oh, we could totally be in a simulation, and here's blah blah blah. And I'm like, what you guys need to do is stop talking and go read Descartes, go read Leibniz, you know, go read Spinoza, go read all those guys, and then come back and tell me, you know, like then think about it and come back and tell me what you think.
I was gonna
Because-
say solving the crisis of universal reality with a crisis of personal identity.
Yeah. Well, the problem with these theories, like modern versions of the simulation theory, are just that they're not philosophically rigorous, you know?
Yeah, and often I feel like a lot of the times they're just meant to like provoke discussion. And
Yeah,
scare people.
it's just like Elon Musk trying to be cool, like, you know, because he thinks, oh, maybe we live in a simulation, and it's like, dude, like,
It's a thought experiment. You can't.
well, look, like, if we were, I mean, it's epistemically problematic. There's no way that we could know that we weren't if it was a perfect simulation.
Why would I care?
Yeah, and then why would I care, right?
If we're in a simulation, then okay, I can do simulation things.
Yeah, and in a sense, I am living in a simulation. My brain is representing the world. Again, like, dude, read your philosophy. Like, these scientists, when they think they're being profound,
I
and
can't say that my reality is a simulation like that.
it is your simulation, though. It's from your brain.
But now I have to think about it, and I'm trying to like get Cartesian theater out of my head. I'm putting like multiple draft theory in there, and
Yeah.
you're like, it's a simulation. Oh,
Like, don't tell me that. No. So yeah, it's all very complicated, but let's talk about pain. Pain is fun, said no one ever. So the International Association for the Study of Pain defines pain as, quote, an unpleasant sensory and emotional experience associated with actual or potential damage, or described in terms of such damage. And they add, pain is always subjective, always. But on the flip side of that, pain also correlates with neural events, you know, like with your C fibers firing. Hilary Putnam, who we were just talking about, has a famous example of pain and C fibers in his paper Minds and Machines, where he's discussing multiple realizability and functionalism. You know, does my conscious experience depend on my brain? That's actually interesting that Blackmore doesn't talk about that in this chapter, about Putnam specifically and functionalism. But functionalism is the idea that, if you'll recall, it's something's function that defines what it is, not what it's made of. So do I need to have a brain to be conscious? Well, if we say that, then we deny the possibility of there being, you know, maybe artificial consciousness or very, very different forms of life that are conscious. You know, we're carbon-based, but maybe there's some silicon-based life out there somewhere, and they'd have radically different brains and physiologies. Do we want to deny that they're conscious? So Putnam uses the example, you know, in our brains and nervous systems, part of realizing pain is having your C fibers firing. But for aliens, maybe it could be something else, like your glot matrix or something alien sounding. I don't know. So when you're injured, you get nerve signals going through your C fibers, which are these unmyelinated neurons. Remember, myelin is this kind of sheath, and it looks white under a microscope. So we have unmyelinated neurons called C fibers in our peripheral nervous system. and they transmit signals up the spinal cord and into the brain stem, then to the thalamus, and to parts of the cortex. Probably your somatosensory cortex, the anterior cingulate cortex, that's what the ACC stands for. Now, we observe correlations between experienced pain, so reported pain, and neural activity, and it's always very close. So if I look at your brain using functional magnetic resonance imaging or a PET scan, I can see perhaps greater activation of the anterior cingulate cortex when pain is rated as being more intense. So if I just give you like a little tap, you know, you're going to not report that as very intense and probably won't see much activity up there. But if I give you like a really nasty pinch, you know, you'll report that it hurts more, but I'll see more activity in that brain area too. Yeah, I'm wondering how they did that. Like, they couldn't get too painful. Did they have to have people that were already in pain? That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, this would be people like maybe medical patients who suffer from chronic pain, right? That's what I think. Like maybe a guy comes in with some kind of injury and, you know, he's got to manage the pain. But we could have him be in the experiment. So just be like, okay, rate your pain on a scale from 1 to 10, and then we'll put you in the fMRI and have a look and, you know, compare across different patients, right? Because it would be unethical to you can't cause your experimental subjects pain. You know, it's unethical. You can't do that. So yeah. Yeah, my pinch example was just, you know, for example's sake. You can't really have an experiment and go, okay, I'm going to pinch you now. Like,
so they can't even like consent to pain.
well, I don't think I don't think you'd ever get something like this through ethics ever,
Yeah.
if you were causing people pain.
Because I know Canada has the law that you can't consent to something that will cause death or grievous.
Yeah, exactly. Our in Canada, according to the charter, you have a right to security of the person, right? To not be injured or killed, right? And in Canada, you cannot waive that right. You don't have the right to waive that right, right?
Yeah, that's one of the arguments is that like that violates the right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like in between cases all the time, and
Yeah.
the law is interpretive all the time. So.
Exactly. And now that we do have assisted, you know, like end of life care, you know, when this all went through the legal system, it set up new precedents, right? I've also heard it discussed. It was when mixed martial arts began to be sanctioned in Canada, because before that you could have mixed martial arts, they weren't sanctioned, so it was like kind of sketchy. You want it sanctioned, you know. Yeah. It's like weed, right? One of the reasons they legalized cannabis was because, you know, do you want to get it from the black market or do you want to get it from somewhere that's maybe a little safer, right? I don't think they have either. And frankly, you know, it was way danker before on the black market, just saying. But, you know, like with the mixed martial arts discussion, you know, that was a thing. Like, look, we've got this thing where, you know, you're stepping into the octagon and you could die. Like, this is dangerous. Can we allow this? Because we technically don't have the right to put ourselves in that kind of danger. In the United States, it's different. You can actually waive that right, such that if you get killed in a fight, the other person is not accountable for murder or manslaughter. Yeah. Yeah, in UFC and boxing and those kinds of combat sports, yeah.
The only reason I knew this is because I was Googling the theoretical capability of like reinstating dueling laws in Canada. So like, does that mean that dueling is illegal in the US and not legal in Canada? Or is the US made like separate anti-dueling laws?
I don't know. I think it would probably depend on the states.
Yeah, I
Um,
feel like it.
because I think gun control in the States is a whole other thing, right?
No,
But
no beat at high noon. or
yeah,
anything
but
that.
like different states have different gun regulations, right?
Yeah.
So they're weird. But anyway, that's politics. So, but back to pain, which is fun. Yeah, we see correlations between pain activity in the brain and reported pain. And this is cool. We can compare pain, just like we can with conscious vision. We can compare the subjective side of things with the objective events in the nervous system. Quite similar to the psychophysicists of the 19th century. They were comparing subjective experience with objective measures of the stimuli, how loud the sound is, or rather, yeah, like how loud a reported sound is compared to, the measured sound pressure. And stuff like that. So again, back, what does all this correlation mean? Does it mean there's a causal relationship there? I think it probably does, but does neural activity cause pain? Is that what causes the pain, the activity in the nervous system? Or does the subjective experience of pain cause the neural activity? It's a chicken or the egg thing, right? Or maybe something else is happening. Maybe. Pinch yourself real quick. Well, just not hard, but just a little pinch. And then ask, where's the pain? Is it in your hand? Well, maybe. It seems to be here. I feel it there. It seems to me that I feel something there where I pinched right there for those online, where I pinched myself. That's where it seems to be. But identity theorists would say the pain is just in your brain or in your C fibers, because that's what's that's where the activity is, right? Oh, I got a typo there. This should say mind, not find. Dualists would say the pain's in your mind. So it has no location because the mind is immaterial. It's the soul. What if you don't have an arm? What about phantom pain? This is where things get really interesting. Phantom pain. Amputees sometimes have this phantom pain, phantom limb syndrome, sometimes it's called, where even though a limb is missing, you phenomenally feel the limb is still present. And sometimes there can even be pain in that limb that you don't have. It's as clearly located in their phantom limb as pain would be in my physical limb, even though there's no actual physical limb. Very crazy. Even, Ramachandran's done some really interesting work rehabilitating people with phantom pain. And the reason why this happens is very, very interesting. Let's just make sure I'm not getting ahead of myself. Holy moly, a long set of slides. We'll just talk a little bit about phantom pain a bit more, and we'll save the rest for next time. But this is discussed in the book. On your brain, you have your somatosensory cortex. Remember, we talked about it last time when we talked about the somatosensory homunculus, the representation of a human, and it's got like gigantic hands and a big face. So different bits of your body on your somatosensory cortex are represented across the surface of the cortex. But it's not represented, the way that your body is actually laid out. It's kind of like your hand is near your face. Weird stuff like that. It's weird. You can see an image of the, yeah, a weird homunculus, but flat and mirrored on both sides, right? So somebody with phantom pain, for example, maybe they've lost their arm and they have phantom pain. Ramachandran found that if, for example, he touched one of these patients, he lost an arm, he touched him on this cheek here with like a Q-tip, you just do a little swab. He could feel the touch in his phantom arm. What? Why? Oh, Well, it's because in the brain, you know, your arm isn't there anymore. But if your arm is represented next to your face, the face representation neurons start taking over where the arm was represented. So you get some kind of spillover of activity. So by touching here, you feel it in the phantom arm. Well, yeah.
So like every 4 months, I get a spinal injection.
Okay.
And so like, you can, when it goes in, if it like hits a nerve, you can feel,
Yeesh.
it's not like terrible, like I'm used to it. But anyway, it's like you feel pain in different parts of your body.
Huh.
So I'll often feel pain, like not bad, but I'll feel a little like twinge in my like thigh or in my rib cage.
Huh.
So
Yeah.
it's like, it's really interesting because, you know, it's not actually there.
Right.
You know.
But like maybe if the needle hits a nerve, then that nerve maybe represents it like down here or somewhere else.
Yeah.
It's really crazy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And Descartes, you know, Rene Descartes thought phantom pain worked because the nerves were like strings, and maybe if you were missing a limb, maybe further up something was happening. He wasn't quite right, but he was kind of on the right track.
I was gonna say, when I was younger, I shouted, I think it's the radius or whatever. But then when it healed, it like started pinching the nerves in my elbow.
Oof.
And so it doesn't hurt and it's not bad, but it means that occasionally I'll have an itch somewhere on my hand that when I try to scratch my hand, it doesn't actually like get rid of the itch. And then I scratch my elbow and it goes away.
Yeah.
Weird stuff like that.
Yeah, it is weird. It's really weird. I remember I was talking about this in another class, but I had a case of sciatica for a few years back in grad school, and that was a pain, literally, because the injury was here. I had like a bulged out disc. They told me I had degenerative disc disease, and I was like, oh, duh, you know, like, doc, how long do I have? You know, I was worried. They're like, no, that's a bit of a misnomer. It's not a disease. It's not degenerative. Basically, you're getting older and you're tall. So enjoy. And I was like, okay. But yeah, I had a little bulge impinging the nerve, but I would get numb down in my toes. You know, it was really annoying. But another weird thing about phantom limbs that Ramachandran has helped to kind of figure out is treatment for the phantom pain. Sometimes phantom limbs, you know, you feel as though you have a limb like this, and sometimes these limbs have cramps or their fist, you know, maybe a phantom fist closes, and this actually causes so much pain. So if your phantom pain is a result of a phantom limb doing something it's not supposed to do, what Ramachandran does is he puts you in the mirror box. Yeah. So imagine that this arm is not here, right? So missing an arm. So I got this arm. I put it in the mirror box. So I put it in a box with a hole, and there's a mirror here angled such that it looks like my phantom limb is there in real life. And I do all the motions with my phantom limb that I do with this one. So I got the mirror box, and now I've got visual feedback. Now it's like I have two hands again. So all I do is unclench the hand. And the phantom limb, after a while, after a lot of therapy like this, kind of unclenches itself.
That's so
It's so weird, right? It's like physical therapy for a limb that you don't have.
I was gonna say that's one of the ways that they actually help correct the limp is
Oh.
they put a mirror there while you're walking.
Yeah.
And so it looks like you have two okay legs.
Yeah.
And so even though you're limping, your body like compensates against the limp in such a way that it actually corrects it to a normal gait. It's really,
Yeah.
really weird.
And all of these examples that we're going, you know, up here and the one you mentioned, these also all highlight neuroplasticity. You know, in the case of different bits, different other areas of somatosensory representation taking over areas that are no longer being used, neuroplasticity. Uncramping phantom limbs with mirror boxes, neuroplasticity. So it's very cool.
That's amazing.
It is amazing. It's amazing that we all have one of these in our noggins, one of these incredibly complex brains. And that's why we say the brain is perhaps the most complicated thing in the known universe, because it really is super complicated. And yeah, fascinating stuff. We better leave it there for today. So next time we'll finish off our discussion of pain and the neural correlates of consciousness. And then I think we'll talk about dreams, because dreams are awesome. And then on the next class, I'll also get more ideas about what chapters you might like to hear about, because we are ahead. Like I'm on like week 12 material, or no, I'm on week 13 material. How many weeks? No, this is week 11.
This is legal.
And I'm on week 12's material. So we're a little ahead, but we got to come up with some more stuff to talk about. So we will do this together on Friday after I tell you a little bit about dreams. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for those who joined from online, and I'll see you next time. See you Friday. Okay, I'm just going to close the thing.
Thank you.
Welcome. Take care.
But yeah, this is